All right, we can go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the CCN virtual conference and to our second keynote and tutorial presentation. So my name is Layla Ishik. I'm a member of the program committee, and I'm going to give a brief overview of CCN before I introduce the talk and speakers. So this is the CCN Executive and Communication Committees, Thomas Nasselaris, Henrique Nienberg, Russ Poldrak, and Kendrick Kay, as well as the program committee, Gunnar Blom, Megan Peters, Lena Jones, who's my co-host today, Ralph Hefner, Gemma Roig, Carlos Ponce, myself, and Jennifer Lieberman. And the program consists of 3 types of events that we really tried to optimize for the online format. So the first was the Algonauts Challenge, which and presentation, which was the first kickoff event of the conference. So if you missed it, the recording is available on the CCN website. We also have several generative adversarial collaborations, an innovative new style of event that began last year and has continued this year. And this is our second keynote and tutorial. So just to give you a brief rundown of the upcoming events that still happen, we have the generative adversarial collaborations. And so the idea behind these is that often in science, you just have groups of like-minded people talking together, and it's really hard to bring together people with alternative ideas and philosophies. And so that's really what the GAC aims to do, is to bring researchers with alternative theories together to help resolve their differences. So together they design an event that can help disambiguate between these different controversies. And the goal is really to foster healthy and collaborative scientific progress. So we've had one GAC so far, which was extremely interesting, on how the role of visual experience on ventral pathway representations. And we have 4 more upcoming. One is a progress report of all of the GACs from last year, 2020. So you can see how this process evolved over the last year. And then 3 more on what constitutes understanding of the ventral pathway, how does the brain combine generative models and direct discriminative computations and high-level visions, and then a final one on what makes a representation useful. Today, we have our second keynote and tutorial. And so the idea behind these was to move beyond a traditional keynote talk. And so these will include an exciting keynote talk, which I'm looking forward to hearing today. But it will also include a following tutorial to give you a look under the hood to see the technicalities of how that exciting science came about. In addition, it really will encourage open methods, hands-on tutorials, and help educate everyone on these cutting-edge methodologies in order to enable new analyses and showcase the science and work behind the talks we often get to see. And so the goal is for you to really learn the science and the tools. So they will highlight the specific scientific assumptions, their interpretations, their analysis tricks, etc. And we really sought to increase community engagement. So all of the keynote and tutorials were selected from community submissions that were open to the general CCN community. And we really prioritized quality of science, but also quality of the tutorial, diversity, and what we thought everyone would get from the different topics. And so yesterday we had our first tutorial on voxel-wise modeling, which if you missed it, again, a recording is available on the CCN website. And so today we are going to hear from Niko Kriegeskorte, Tal Golan, and Wenxuan on controversial stimuli, optimizing experiments to adjudicate among computational hypotheses. And then there's one following one on flexible identification of population dynamics from neural activity recordings. And so the goal of moving of this year's CCN with everything online is to really make this a success. We really need your participation. So we encourage everyone to come participate in the tutorials, learn all you can, and enjoy it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Niko Kriegeskorte, who's going to deliver the keynote portion of this event. So Niko is a professor at Columbia. in both the departments of psychology and neuroscience, and he is the director of cognitive imaging at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute at Columbia. And many of us know Niko from his pioneering methods in computational cognitive neuroscience. And so we're excited to hear about his recent work in controversial stimuli.
What an amazing conference, Leila. Thank you so much. This is super cool. I'm really excited about what the new program committee and executive committee has done here. Slide sharing working? Great. Okay, so let's talk about controversial stimuli. My title is Controversial Stimuli, Optimizing Experiments to Adjudicate Among Computational Hypotheses. In a sense, what we're talking about here is nothing new at all. It's something very, very standard and something that scientists always do. Scientists always want to design experiments to adjudicate among competing hypotheses. And that's really all we're doing here, just in a new context, in a sense. In perceptual neuroscience, the experimental design involves a choice of stimuli. And when our theories are implemented in complex brain computational models, as is increasingly the case in cognitive computational neuroscience, then we need optimization techniques to make stimuli that elicit distinct predictions from different models. So this is just designing good experiments. And this last phrase here, stimuli that elicit distinct predictions from different models, is the definition of controversial stimuli. So the idea is that these stimuli are controversial between two models or among a set of models. There's also a deeper and more complex issue behind this. And it's the question whether we can make theoretical progress with these highly flexible models that we now have. Neural network models give us a language for expressing computational hypotheses, and that's extremely useful for cognitive computational neuroscience, and it's key to the field actually because it links cognition to its implementation in the brain. It allows us to explore our theoretical ideas about how the information processing in the brain actually works. However, their high parametric complexity is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it means that these models can capture intelligent behavior. And the history of AI has shown that we need high parametric models to capture intelligent processes, because intelligence requires a lot of knowledge. And without that knowledge in the model cannot be intelligent. And therefore, it can also not capture higher level cognitive processes or even perceptual processes. However, this high parametric complexity is also a curse because it makes it hard to adjudicate between models. So the people in our community who feel that these highly flexible models might be problematic, they also have a point. So because it's much more challenging, both at the level of interpretation and at the level of statistical analysis to really test and compare these models. So on the one hand, we need high parametric models to capture cognitive function, but the question is, how can we adjudicate among these highly flexible models? I want to start with two examples from our lab's work that illustrate why we need controversial stimuli. The first example is from Camilla Yotzwick, Kate Storrs, and Jonathan O'Keefe, and it's about explaining human face dissimilarity judgments. So what Camilla and Kate and John did was they generated faces with the Basel face model, a face graphics model, where they sampled on this in these polar coordinates, a set of experimental faces. And then they used a large touch screen to have subjects arrange many different pairs of faces along the vertical dimension to indicate how dissimilar these faces look to them. So this was sort of dragging on the touch screen. You put your finger on and you can drag these pairs around, and it's only the vertical dimension that counts here and enables you to communicate how distinct you perceive every pair of faces. So, and then we used a wide variety of different models in order to predict these face dissimilarity judgments. So a set of models was obtained from the Basel face model, so the internal parameters in the latent space of the Basel face model, as well as separate sets of components of this latent space, the shape parameters and the texture parameters, and a couple of other variations. And they also tested deep neural network models, different versions of the VGG architecture trained with either faces or objects, and the LXNet architecture. And then also some older models, the HMAX model and the GIST model, which provides these summaries of Gabors. So it's a lower level, older engineered feature model. And then a couple of more high level models about the configuration of faces and also about the person attributes of the people. So when they did a model comparison, and here I'm showing you the model accuracy, which is the Pearson correlation of the representational dissimilarities predicted by each of these models. So these are distances in the representational spaces of this model correlated with the dissimilarity judgments. What they found was that some models could be rejected. So we have some models here that are significantly below the noise ceiling. So that's good, we learned something. But there's also this set here of models, all of which are very close to the noise ceiling, and they're not significantly different from each other. And that included image computable models, the DeepNet models, the GIST model, as well as this Basel face space latent models and subcomponents of it. So some good insights here, and it's important to know that all these models do pretty well. But of course, we would like to be able to distinguish these models because not all of them are likely to be correct simultaneously. So why can't we distinguish these models here? And the reason is that the models are confounded. They make similar predictions for natural and synthetic faces that are not chosen expressly to discriminate them. So if we wanted to take the next step and discriminate these models, we'd have to design our stimulus set in some way. The second example is from Kate Storrs, and she found that diverse deep nets all explain the human inferior temporal representational geometry similarly well after categorization task training and fitting to the IT representational geometry. So we use the term training when we adapt the model to perform the task as well as possible. And we use the term fitting when we adapt a model to explain brain or behavioral data as well as possible. So here Kate did both on a number of classical and well-known vision models. And I'm showing you here the accuracy with which each of these models predicts the human IT representational dissimilarity matrix for a set of little isolated natural object images. So here in the different colors, we have all combinations of trained and untrained and fitted and unfitted, where trained, as I've told you, refers to the categorization task training, and fitting to the adaptation to make the model better capture the representational geometry, which involved computing a PCA for a separate set of images and then inferring some weights for these PCA components. So for LXNet, it looks like this. So both training and fitting helps somewhat, but even the untrained and unfitted model with random weights explains some variance already. And then when we look at all the other models, we see a strikingly similar picture, with most of the models sort of approaching the lower bound of the noise ceiling, but not quite reaching the noise ceiling, and the models very similar to each other. So all these models were trained and tested on natural images, and we think that might be part of the problem here. We think that it's the shared features of these models, the deep hierarchy and the fact that they're all convolutional, that explain the relative success of these models. So why can't we distinguish the models? Well, each model's parameter space is too expressive here. It's a universal approximator for the distinct inductive biases that these models do have to be revealed when we're training and testing on natural images and then fitting to brain activity data. So despite our doing the statistics correctly here, we're using cross-validation, we're using independent image sets, there's nothing wrong with the statistics, but the flexibility of the models means that for natural images, they end up making all similar predictions. So this brings us to controversial stimuli and Tal Golan's motivation for pursuing this direction in our lab. Training and testing on different sets of natural images often does not reveal the differences between models. So we need stronger tests of generalization performance. This is, I think, a very, very important point that Tal keeps making in my lab. The first insight is that to elicit models' distinct inductive biases, we can test models on a population of stimuli that was not used in training. So this is an out-of-distribution generalization challenge, and it provides a more severe test of each of the models. To do this, we could use natural stimuli. For example, we could use stimuli drawn from a different stimulus population, or we could use synthetic stimuli optimized to elicit bolder predictions from each of the models. The second important insight is that since our goal is to adjudicate among models, because we want to make theoretical progress, we want to find differences between models that provide us some direction for changing our theoretical positions, we can create synthetic stimuli that are optimized to elicit distinct predictions from different models. Stimuli that are controversial among the models. So one way to create synthetic stimuli that elicit bolder predictions from each of the models is to create maximally exciting stimuli for particular layers of a model or particular units in a model. So you choose some portion of the model, for example, a unit, and then you optimize a stimulus so as to drive that unit as strongly as possible, and possibly more strongly than natural stimuli would. And then the model makes a strong prediction, which is that the corresponding neurons in the brain also respond very strongly to that very unnatural stimulus. And since that stimulus is very different from any stimuli used in training the model, this provides a strong test of generalization performance. However, our interest here is in controversial stimuli because we're interested in adjudicating among different models. So in that case, we need to define some controversiality measure, some quantitative objective that we can optimize that compares the outputs of both models. So it could be that the models categorize a given stimulus differently, or it could be something about the representational geometry, for example, that the RDMs are not highly correlated, or something like that. We need to define the controversiality, and then we can use various optimization techniques to change the stimuli, to optimize the stimuli, usually iteratively, and make a set of stimuli that achieves a high controversiality score. Tal first explored this using the MNIST data set. So in a very small kind of toy setting, that's already interesting because we have these natural little handwritten digits. And he tested a wide range of different vision models. And an important thing in designing this was to have the models really sample interesting theoretical dimensions. So Tal wanted to have feed-forward models as well as recurrent models, and he wanted to have generative as well as discriminative models and fill all these four resulting quadrants. So here are the actual models. Some of them were feed-forward discriminative. That's the sort of standard deep neural network categories. Some of those were adversarially trained. And then there were recurrent models that were discriminative in their inference mode. And then there were generative models where the inference was nevertheless feed-forward, just one of them, the Gaussian kernel density estimator model. And then there were recurrent models that use some kind of generative approach to perceptual inference. So that included the capsule net recon and the shot analysis by synthesis, or shot ABS model. The controversiality index in this case was defined as follows. Controversiality is indexed by the digit pair and the model pair. So controversiality is defined for a model pair and a digit pair, and it's a function of the image. And it's this function, it's this minimum across 4 probabilities. And we're maximizing the controversiality, so we're maximizing this minimum, which means that we're ensuring that all 4 of these probabilities are high. So what do these probabilities mean? This one means that model A detects digit A. This one means that model A does not detect digit B, thinks that digit B is very unlikely to be present in the image. This one means that model B detects digit B, and that this one means that model B does not detect digit A. So it's a full double dissociation, if you will. Model A thinks it's A with high confidence and not B, and model B thinks it's B with high confidence and not A. So that's a very strong way to define controversiality. To get a better intuition on this, Tal plotted the model output as a contrast. So here's, you see the probability that model A assigns to the image containing a 7 minus the probability that model A assigns to the image containing a 3. So that's a contrast where at one end of the axis, model A detects a 3 but not a 7, and at the other end it detects a 7 but not a 3. We can do the same for model B, and we get this 2-dimensional space. So in these 2 quadrants, the models agree about a given stimulus. And in these 2 quadrants, the models disagree. When we look at the original MNIST images, they all fall in these corners, so deep into the model agreement quadrants. And this illustrates how it's going to be very difficult to distinguish the models based on their behavior, because they've all been overtrained with this set of natural little handwritten digits, and their behavior is essentially going to be mostly correct for all of the models and also identical to human categorizations of these images. So if we really want to say something about the computational mechanism, we have to probe the models with different stimuli, and we can use optimization to drive an initial seed of a random image into this model disagreement quadrant here. So here you have a controversial stimulus, which to model A is a 7 but not a 3, and to model B, it's a 3 but not a 7. I see a 7 there, so I would say in this case, I agree with model A, but of course we need to ask subjects in psychophysical experiments. So this is an example of a controversial stimulus for this MNIST data set. So in this way, we can pit models against each other. So here, let's pit CapsNet Recon versus Marjorie L2. When we do that, we can do that for all pairs of stimuli. So here, for a given pair of models, you see all pairs of stimuli. And for each of these stimuli, you can ask yourself, what does it look like to you? And does your label, the label you would put on that image, agree with the label provided by CapsNet Recon or Marjorie L2? So in this case, there's a bit of ambiguity here, but most of us see columns of consistent digits here, indicating that they're their perception of these images is more consistent with the labeling provided by CapsuleNet Recon. So let's pit CapsuleNet Recon versus the Gaussian kernel density estimator. And in this case, even more clearly, most people see rows of consistent digits, indicating that the Gaussian KDE better captures human perception. So let's pit Gaussian KDE against shot analysis by synthesis. In this case, most of us clearly see columns of digits here, indicating that the shot analysis by synthesis model appears to dominate the Gaussian KDE model. So TAL generated these controversial images for all pairs of digits and all pairs of models, creating this, this really large set of stimuli. And then he used these stimuli in a psychophysical experiment. And in the experiment, subjects were presented with one of these stimuli at a time, and then they indicated the probability that the image they're looking at contained each of the digits. And these probabilities did not have to add up to 1. So it was perfectly reasonable to indicate that there's a lot of evidence or high probability for 2 of the digits at the same time in the image. So when TAL analyzed the data, the first thing we note is we can compare all these models, and they perform distinctly. But a prominent feature of the set of results is that none of the models reaches the noise ceiling. So we note this large gap here between the noise ceiling and the best performing model. And the second observation is that the best performing model here is the shot analysis by synthesis model, perhaps consistent with what you could experience by just looking at the controversial stimuli. And this shot ABS model was significantly better than all of the other models in this analysis. When we look at the 3 relatively best performing models here and look back at our entire scheme of the different models, we note that all of the 3 best performing models involve some kind of generative inference process. So we think that by testing these multiple models, we can get some interesting theoretical insights as well. I'll then scale this up to natural images using these small images of the CIFAR 10 image set. So now we're going to look at a pair of categories rather than a pair of models, and at all of the different models. So let's start with one example. Here is a particular stimulus, a stimulus that was optimized to look like a horse to the graph wall joint energy model, which is a hybrid generative and discriminative model. And at the same time, the stimulus was optimized to look like a cat to the 1PCN A6 model. To me, this looks more like a horse. So I would say my perception agrees better with the graph wall joint energy model in this case. But let's look at more of the stimuli. Let's start in the upper left and look at these 3 models at the top there. So for these models, the controversial stimuli we get are these rubbish images. And these meet the high standard for controversiality. So for each of these, one of the models is very sure that it's a horse and not a cat. And the other model is very sure that it's a cat and not a horse. So this provides pretty strong evidence against both of the models. And actually, these stimuli are a special case of controversial stimuli, which are adversarial stimuli. And TAL is going to tell you much more about how adversarial stimuli relate to controversial stimuli. But the short version is that adversarial stimuli are a special case of controversial stimuli, where the stimuli are controversial between a model and some oracle that tells us the ground truth label. when we look at the angstrom L infinity model, we see that these stimuli perhaps look a little bit more cat-like. So that model, I would say, from just eyeballing this, seems to dominate the first three models. And when we look at the ones optimized to look like a horse to angstrom, they also look more like horses when the angstrom L infinity is pitted against the first three models. So this seems to be a somewhat better model. And then when we look at the angstrom L2 model, that in turn seems to dominate not just the first three models, but also the L infinity model. Again, we're seeing sort of cats along the vertical here and perhaps horses. I mean, this is highly subjective, right? Don't believe me. Draw your own conclusions or wait for the psychophysical results, which will be in the next slide. And then we remember the Gaussian KDE model performed very well on the MNIST data set, and it's a very simple example of a generative model. So when we used it on this in the slightly more complex scenario here on natural images, the Gaussian KDE model failed really badly. So this does worse definitely than the angstrom model, and not even better than not even clearly better than the initial three models. And then when we looked at the graph-wolf joint energy model, we found that this one seemed to dominate all the other models, and you can intuitively appreciate that from looking just at this one pair of categories, horse and cat here, where along the lower row you see most of us see horses, and along the right column, most of us see cats. So when Tal did the psychophysical experiment, these were the results. Again, the most striking feature is this big gap between all of the models and the noise ceiling. So this indicates that all of the models, as usual, are incorrect. But there are significant differences between the models. And the best model was the graph-wolf joint energy model, the hybrid generative and discriminative model, which significantly dominated all the other models. You can also see the failure of the Gaussian KDE model here. Tal then scaled this up to natural images, larger natural images from the ImageNet data set. And here now, since we're dealing with bigger images and bigger models and more parameters, we're limited to models that are differentiable. So we can't have models where the optimization procedure needs to be gradient free. We need gradients to do the optimization. So we're somewhat more limited in the models that we can explore so far. But here are 4 models to make a start on that. So when Tal pitted the Inception V3 model against the ResNet 50, he got these kind of interesting looking rubbish images, providing evidence against both of these models. And then when he pitted these adversarially trained models of 2 different architectures, ResNet and WRN, against these first 2 models, and he got these results. So these results are somewhat consistent with the category. These images have been optimized to look like to the adversarially trained models, the Weimaraner dog category. So this seems to be looking somewhat encouraging for the adversarially trained models. And when we then looked at the opposing quadrant, where the stimuli were optimized to look like Persian cats to the adversarially trained models, and like Weimaraner dogs to the first 2 models, that you get these textures that perhaps are a little more consistent in my subjective perception with the fur of cats than with the shape and fur of Weimaraner dogs. So this would seem to provide some evidence in favor of these adversarially trained models over the first 2 models, at least. However, when Tal contrasted the 2 adversarially trained models, he got these monster-looking images that don't really have any clear classification. And this suggests to us that these adversarially trained models also do not really account for human perception. So we still have some way to go, but we have a little bit of a hint which directions in model space might be good to move in. And more recently, we took this to the language domain. So this is a collaboration with Christopher Baldessano's lab. Tal worked together with Matthew Siegelman, a PhD student in Chris's lab, to take controversial stimuli to the language domain. And Tal and Matt tested a variety of language models. They fell into three categories: n-gram models, the 2-gram and 3-gram models, which use text corpus frequencies of unique phrases of length n to make predictions about the probability of the upcoming word. And this can then be extended to making predictions about the probability of entire sentences. They also used classical neural network models. So these are recurrent neural nets using fixed token embeddings. And they used some of these more modern transformer neural network models, which are neural nets that use context-dependent embeddings and multiple attention heads. And there were 5 different models in this class, including BERT and Roberta and GPT-2 and a couple of others. So to get an intuition on how they made these controversial sentences, let's imagine the space of all sentences, which of course is a discrete space, as a continuous space, just to get some intuition. So each of the models assigns a probability to each possible sentence. So here I'm drawing one probability distribution over sentence space, and I'm associating that with the BERT model. So here are the high probability sentences. Here are the low probability sentences. Now, if we look at another model, let's say GPT-2, we get a different distribution. There is some region of agreement here. In the lower region here, both models agree that the sentence is likely. In the upper region there, both models agree that the sentence is unlikely. And in the other regions here, outside this agreement region, we have the controversial sentences, right? So these controversial regions of sentence space are the regions that are useful to us as scientists to adjudicate among the models. The distribution of sentences that are considered likely by humans tends to fall somewhere here, where when several models agree that the sentence is likely, then often humans also think it's likely. But there are some sentences that are likely according to humans that some of the models think are very unlikely. So that's where the models fail to capture the likeliness of different sentences in English. So Tal and Matt and Chris wanted to anchor the generation of these controversial stimuli in the high probability natural sentences. So they started with a natural sentence in each case. I'm calling that N here. And then they optimized that sentence by changing one word at a time according to an objective function, where they minimized the probability of the sentence according to GPT-2, for example, under the constraint that the probability according to BERT stayed at least the same. So for BERT, we stay in this plateau of high probability here, the blue region, but for GPT-2, we go down to a low probability region. And that's the optimized synthetic sentence 1. And then we can also make a synthetic sentence 2, where we flip the two models and we minimize the probability of the sentence according to BERT, while keeping the probability according to GPT-2 at least the same. So now we're staying on the green plateau associated with the GPT-2 model. So here's some examples of these sentences. It's really quite intriguing. So they started in this case with the sentence, "This is the lie you have been sold." So that's a natural sentence that they just found in corpus of sentences. And then they optimized it to be unlikely in the eyes of GPT-2 and still equally likely, at least in the eyes of Bird. And they got the sentence, "This is the week you have been dying." So note that this is a perfectly grammatical sentence. However, it is an unlikely sentence because of its meaning. And when they did the opposite and minimized the probability according to Bird while maintaining the high probability according to GPT-2, they got this sentence. "That is the narrative we have been sold." So this is a perfectly grammatical sentence and quite a likely sentence. It's probably been uttered many times. So in this case, it looks as though the probability distribution that determines human perception of how likely different sentences are, at least in this one example, appears to be better aligned with GPT-2. In fact, when subjects were asked whether synthetic sentence 1 or synthetic sentence 2 is more likely, 10 out of 10 subjects found synthetic sentence 2 more likely. So these kinds of sentences were generated, and many of them, and we performed an experiment in 10 sets of 10 subjects each, so 100 subjects in total, with sort of these separate replications of the experiment embedded in it. And the subjects were presented with this question for each of the pairs of sentences: which sentence is more likely to be encountered? So in this case, it would be these two synthetic sentences. That is the narrative we have been sold, and this is the week you have been dying, and all 10 out of 10 subjects picked the one on the left. We also got some confidence information there, but I'm not going to be showing you results that use this information. So it's at the moment, it's just about deciding which one is relatively more likely. So when analyzing the results here, when we look at random natural sentences, which are also included in the experiment for comparison, we find that all the models are relatively close to the noise ceiling and not significantly below the noise ceiling. So you could say, oh, great news, we can completely explain our data. However, that's true for all of the models and just reflects the relatively low power here. So in these results graphs that I'm showing you, this dashed line is chance performance because it's about pairs of sentences. So it's about making a binary decision. Each dot here is one replication of the experiment. There are 10 replications. In each replication, there were 10 new subjects and a totally new set of stimuli, so different pairs of sentences. So when we treat this replication as a random effect, we can do inference that generalizes to the population of subjects and also to the population of sentence pairs. And here in gray, as always, is the noise ceiling for comparison. So in this case, none of the models were significantly different from any other models, and none of the models were could be rejected based on the data. They all were within the range of the lower bound of the noise ceiling. When we used controversial sentences, we saw a much more interesting picture where the range of performance of the different models is much wider. So now we see that several of the models can be rejected. They're significantly below the lower bound of the noise ceiling, indicated by the black star here. And also when we did the pairwise model comparisons, we now saw that when GPT-2, for example, dominated all the models except Roberta in this example. And there are many other significant model comparison results. So this particular analysis is based on natural sentences that were selected to be controversial. So this is not the synthetic sentences that I illustrated for you before. When they used these synthetic sentences, results were even more striking, with a much stronger contrast between the performance of the different models. Some of the very simple models are driven below chance performance here, and that's because they're pitted against better models. And these are binary decisions, and the better models, so to speak, trick them into performing below chance level. And in this case, we can reject most of the models on the basis of the data, and we also get a lot of significant pairwise model comparisons. We can also pool all the data together, so this gives kind of like an overall summary of this experiment. So that includes all the trials that I've shown you before, and additionally the trials where one of the sentences was natural and the other sentence was synthetic. And when we look at this, we have enough power to reject all of the models, and we find many pairwise comparisons significant, giving some indication about which of these modeling developments might be on the right track in one way or another. But the GPT-2 model, although it dominated most of the other models, did not significantly dominate the Roberta model. So conclusions on the controversial sentences: human behavioral experiments with random natural sentences render it difficult to distinguish models and detect shortcomings of the best models. Controversial sentences, whether natural or synthetic, reveal the shortcomings of all of the models and provide starker contrasts among the models. So zooming out and moving toward the conclusion, there's a historical debate about whether to use artificial stimuli or natural stimuli. Artificial stimuli are controlled. They're often designed to adjudicate between models we have, and they're often simpler historically. Natural stimuli are less controlled. They're more ecologically valid. They enable us to test models under the conditions under which our brains function in real life. And they're often more complex. And there's a long-standing debate between these two extremes. We can think of controversial stimuli as a kind of synthesis of these two extreme perspectives, where you get some of the benefits of each of them. So you can have stimuli that are complex, that have some clearly natural content in them, as is reflective of knowledge that the models have learned about what things look like in the world. But they are also designed to adjudicate between models. So they give us a lot of power to make theoretical progress. Despite our excitement about controversial stimuli, I want to stress that model-independent natural stimuli remain essential for neuroscience and remain very important also in our lab. So we're not about to stop using natural stimuli. We should always have them in our experiments. We should anchor our analyses in natural stimuli, but then also venture out into the controversial regions of stimulus space in order to more strongly test the inductive biases of different models. So natural stimuli provide a general purpose tool for testing models with big data sets. There's no need to know the models in advance. That's a big advantage of natural stimuli. And they're ecologically valid. I'm particularly excited about this project, spearheaded by Thomas Nassalaris and Kendrick Kay, where they acquired this massive 7 Tesla data set with a big set of natural stimuli. And we're excited about starting to analyze this data set because it's really a very rich resource and very useful. So in conclusion, controversial stimuli provide optimized probes for adjudicating among computational hypotheses. Controversial stimuli reveal distinct inductive biases of different DeepNet models. Human vision may rely on a computational mechanism that combines elements of discriminative and generative inference. And current language models differ in their ability to recognize high probability English sentences, but none of them can fully account for human judgments of the relative likeliness of different sentences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niko. That was a fantastic talk. We have some time for questions. So I think how the best way to do this is to have people either chat their questions if they prefer, and I can read them. Or if you would like to raise your hand and ask the question directly, I can unmute you. And so while we're waiting, maybe I'll ask my question first, which was about how to interpret when you pit two models against each other and the results look nonsensical. I think you were referring to those as that is evidence of both models being bad. But I could also see a scenario in which, for example, if you ask two humans to come up with a controversial stimulus, it would probably look like neither of the two categories, right? So how can you distinguish between if the models are equally good versus equally bad?
Yeah, that's a great point. So it could be that we can make controversial stimuli also for pairs of people, right? So it could be that it's possible, for example, through very extensive psychophysics to make some weird stimulus where you show it to me and I say, well, clearly that's a face, and you wouldn't have any idea. We would think it's something completely different. And that would highlight differences between our brains. And I think it's an incredibly exciting avenue to go in. In terms of testing models, this is opening a big can of worms and a very important challenge, which is that our models are also idiosyncratic like individuals. So every architecture, when trained on a given training data set, when it's trained from a different seed and or it's trained with a different sample of stimuli from the same distribution even, gives you a totally different trained neural net, right? And so in subtle ways, different instances of the same model behave differently. And it's very important to check when you make an adversarial stimulus or a controversial stimulus, whether that stimulus generalizes to new samples from the same distribution of models, right? There's work from Tim Kietzmann's lab that has looked at the individual differences among deep neural networks, and that's sort of a step in that direction. TEL is also thinking about this very deeply, how we can integrate distributions of instances of each of the models into our inference framework, but that's yeah, quite a new direction that we don't have definitive results on yet.
Thanks. Elena, did you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it?
I can read it. Yeah, so my question is, could you speak more about the inductive biases that these models have? So like in convolutional neural networks, the big inductive bias that everyone says it has is the translation invariance bias. Is there some sort of like in what you've seen in these models using these controversial stimuli, can you summarize, is it possible to summarize the inductive biases in the same way? Or
yeah, so they share the inductive biases of deep convolutional feed-forward networks. So one of them is translation invariance or translation equivariance, that the same features are detected automatically all over the image, and that is one very important inductive bias. But some of them have an additional inductive bias, which is that it helps to form a complete mental model of each of the classes that you're trying to discriminate, right? So the winning model in the MNIST example was the shot analysis by synthesis model, and this really learns a generative model of digits. So from this model, you can generate digits, and they look like natural digits, and it uses this generative power in order to infer what a given digit is, right? So this speaks to this ongoing debate of perspectives between the feed-forward and discriminative approach to vision, which is very influential in visual computational neuroscience and also very influential in computer vision. And it's the approach that actually has made it into our cell phones. So in that sense, it's been much more practically successful. and the generative perspective on it, which provides a very different inductive bias and a more normatively motivated approach to doing vision. So the way you should do it from a Bayesian perspective, where you make your prior knowledge explicit and then you interpret the image as evidence in the light of what you know about what the whole distribution of images is for each of the digit classes or the categories, right? So this is the biggest distinction between these different models in terms of their inductive biases. And a tentative result from this analysis is that the generative inductive bias in some form is important for explaining human perception.
Thank you. I do have another question, maybe not a follow-up, but a different one.
Sure.
So it has to do with the idea of confounding. So could you speak a bit more on like how different models who perform very similarly, like what exactly is that confounding that you were using to explain why they perform so similarly?
Yeah. So I mean, think of cats and dogs, right? So let's say you want to learn to distinguish cats and dogs. They differ in many ways, right? You could recognize them by the ears, or you could recognize them by the mouths. And if you have two models and one uses the ears and the other uses the mouths, and you only test on natural images of cats and dogs, then both of these models are going to be perfectly able to do this if they're big enough, you know, to really be good at recognizing dog mouths and cat mouths and knowing the difference between them. And so then at the level of their behavior, these models wouldn't differ, but at the level of their mechanism, they do differ a lot, right? And when we deal with other people, let's say we talk to our children or we teach students, we make these inferences about what is actually going on in their minds, right? How are they making these inferences? And that would be different in these two models, despite the fact that they perfectly well can discriminate cats and dogs, right? So in this case, by making controversial stimuli, you'd end up making stimuli that change the features of the mouths and ears, and you could see from just eyeballing the stimuli which set of features drives the responses in each of these models, and then you could tell the difference between them, and you could also compare them to humans and find out whether humans rely more on the ears or the mouths.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I can take them offline.
I mean, we are running, we're at 10 o'clock, right? So it's also time for Tal's talk.
Yep, I think we're right on time, which is great. So thank you again, Niko, for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to propose that before Tal's talk, we take a 5-minute break. And so we'll meet back here at, let's say, 10:05. We'll resume at 10:05. So Tal, whenever you're ready, we can, I'll stop sharing. And I've changed it so that others can share screen in case they have questions during the tutorial. During your talk portion, I was going to keep everyone muted and monitor the raise hands and chat. Does that sound good? Okay, so we're going to resume again with the tutorial portion from Tal Golan. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this exciting work from a hands-on perspective. I think the best way to ask questions during the first portion of the tutorial is to either type them in the chat and I'll monitor that and ask Tal, or if you'd like to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask it directly.
Okay. Hi, so this tutorial will have 3 parts. In the first part, I will give an overview on both practical and theoretical considerations related to synthesizing controversial stimuli. I will begin from the basic optimization loop for creating controversial stimuli. Then I will compare controversial stimuli to alternative approaches. Next, I will briefly discuss the results from generalizing this method to ImageNet. And last, we'll discuss ways of restricting the stimulus space in which we search for controversial stimuli. Then we'll have time for some more questions and discussion. And for those that will choose to stick with us to the end, we'll have about 1 hour of hands-on PyTorch implementation exercise. Okay, so let's begin with the basic optimization loop. So we start from a stimulus X, and I would strongly argue to use a random noise image as the initial image. So any structure that will emerge in that image, in the stimulus, will emerge due to the models and not due to our initialization. So now we take the stimulus and we feed it into 2 neural networks, model A and model B. And we collect their outputs, which we interpret as predictions about human responses. We calculate a controversiality score, which is a function that should be high when the 2 models disagree. For example, if these are 2 object classifiers, if they see distinct categories with high confidence, then the controversiality score should be high. And as Niko mentioned, in our studies, we use the heuristic approach in which we chose 2 categories at a time and calculated this controversiality score in respect to these categories. So once we have this score, we can use an optimization algorithm to change the pixels of the stimulus to increase its controversiality. We run this loop until we cannot make further improvements. And then we have our controversial stimulus. We produce many controversial stimuli. And then we present these stimuli to human subjects in a formal behavioral experiment in which we compare between the judgments of the subjects and the predictions of the models. And we are now guaranteed that for a given stimulus and a given subject, the subject will not be able to agree with both models, as often happens with natural images. If the models are differentiable, and this is usually the case, then we can calculate the gradient of the controversiality score with respect to the pixels of the stimulus. Here, this is just the set of partial derivatives of the score with respect to each pixel. And if we have that, we can feed this gradient into a stochastic gradient descent algorithm like Adam. And this is a very fast and efficient way of creating controversial stimuli. It takes less than a few minutes per image. I'm now going to make a couple of practical, technical points before we shift gears and discuss more theoretical considerations. So one practical point is about stimulus preprocessing. Usually these networks are trained not on raw images, but on images that were preprocessed. So this preprocessing usually includes centering and scaling of the RGB values, resizing the image to a certain size, and even sometimes changing the order of the color channels. Often, this preprocessing is not part of the object that describes the model. It's somewhere in the training and evaluation code. And different models might be trained using different conventions of preprocessing. So it's really important to get this right, to feed each model with the images preprocessed as it was trained. I found that the best way to ensure that is to encapsulate each model along with its preprocessing in a Python class. So we form for each model a class that receives raw images as inputs and generates the outputs that we'd like to test. If you're using PyTorch, then you can make this class a child class of Torch and a module. Sorry, if you're using PyTorch. Yeah. Okay, so that's that. And one more practical consideration, images have limited intensity range. So if we are using floating point representation, then the pixels should have intensity values between 0 to 1. If we just run some optimization algorithm, they might run beyond these limits. I found that the best way to ensure that we respect this constraint is by reparametrizing the stimulus. So instead of optimizing directly the stimulus, we are optimizing a tensor Z, which has the same shape as the stimulus X, but its values are allowed to run between -infinity and infinity. And we use the sigmoid function to compress Z into a valid image X. And now we optimize Z. And once we are done, we are taking X as our resulting image. And we will see later that this concept of reparametrizing the stimulus is useful for also more sophisticated tasks. Okay, so
Tal, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Can you give an intuitive explanation about why that reparameterization helps?
So in this particular case, Z can have any value that it will get, so up to infinity. And once you apply the sigmoid, all of these values are mapped to the 0 to 1 bound.
So it makes the optimization easier to have.
So now you can run optimization without any constraint. You don't need to run constraint optimization that has its issues.
Got it. Thanks.
So this is a common trick, common approach to constraint optimization by reparametrizing the variables. So the new problem is unconstrained. I should say that I welcome questions, and you can also use the chat. Wengo, a graduate student in our lab, is monitoring that, and she would be able to answer even while I speak. Okay. So now, once we cleared the table, we can discuss some more theoretical considerations. So I'm going to compare controversial stimuli to alternative approaches. So one alternative approach would be to have a human in the loop. So in principle, we can have the person here inside the optimization loop and optimize stimuli that will cause disagreement between the model and the human observer. I think that this is a very attractive idea, but it's very inefficient. It's very difficult at the moment. Our speed of evaluating human subjects is several orders of magnitude slower than how we can evaluate neural networks. And we also don't have gradients from human subjects. So this is attractive, but inefficient. I'm quite sure that in the future, this will be done. A different approach, which is widely utilized and obviously predates ours, is adversarial examples. So when we create adversarial examples, we are optimizing images or other stimuli, so they cause an incorrect prediction in our targeted model. In an ideal setting, we have access to some kind of ground truth oracle. And then we can, if we have that, we can directly optimize stimuli that are guaranteed to induce an error in the model. This might apply, for example, if we have some kind of simulated environment. In general settings, we don't have a ground truth oracle, or it might be expensive to evaluate. So we almost always use a ground truth stand-in when we create adversarial examples. Some simple heuristic that replaces that ground truth. And the most common ground truth stand-in that we have is the epsilon robustness notion. So the idea is that we consider a natural image along with its human driven label. And we make the assumption that within a certain ball of radius epsilon, a ball in image space, the correct label doesn't change. So if we apply perturbation whose magnitude is lesser or equal to epsilon, the model should keep its original classification. So we use this heuristic, and now we don't know anything about, we don't make any assumption about the responses, the ground truth outside the ball. So we just search within the ball for images for which the model disagree with this ground truth standing. If we cannot do that, if we run this optimization and we cannot find images that cause this kind of disagreement, then we would say that this model is epsilon robust. So that's not, this is an informal definition of epsilon robustness. So an epsilon robust model will not change its classification of a clean image for perturbations of magnitude lesser or equal to epsilon. And here you can see a typical way of how this is quantified. So the x-axis is the size, the magnitude of the perturbation, and the y-axis is the model's accuracy. And if we have a model which is more robust in this epsilon robustness sense, then its accuracy curve will go down more slowly. And this model depicted here is actually quite robust. This is an adversarially trained model. If you'll take a standard discriminative object classifier, its accuracy will drop to 0 at the moment that you will start introducing adversarial perturbations, even if these adversarial perturbations are very small. From the perspective of cognitive computational neuroscience, this is interesting, but it's not exactly the thing that we are after, because epsilon robustness and model human alignment are not the same thing. These are related ideas. So if you have a model which is very non-robust in this epsilon robustness sense, if it completely changes its predictions in response to tiny perturbations that humans cannot see, then it cannot be human aligned. But if we develop models that are more and more robust in the epsilon robustness sense, these models will not necessarily become human aligned. And the reason for that is that these perturbations, they are measured in image space. So these distances are almost unrelated to perceptual distances. So we can still use adversarial examples. I think that it's critical to add the behavioral evaluation of the images if we want to draw neuroscientific insights. There are already a couple of papers, a couple of studies that are starting to do that. But there is one more disadvantage to using adversarial examples, which is that this heuristic, this ground truth studying, is quite simplistic. If we'll use another model, a neural network model, as the ground truth studying, we might challenge the first model in a more severe way, exposing new failure modes that we can't see when we just use the epsilon ball assumption. And now we also can search over the entire stimulus space. We don't need to limit ourselves to the vicinity of a clean image. So this is why we say that adversarial examples are a special case of controversial stimuli. Okay, the next point will be about our results from generalizing to ImageNet. So you've already seen this matrix, but I'd like to make a couple of more points. So here we created stimuli that caused one model to detect a Persian cat and another model to detect a Weimaraner dog. So for example, this image is classified as a Persian cat by Resident 50 and as a Weimaraner dog by Inception. Once we use adversarially trained networks and we pair them with standard networks, then we get something which is not really Persian cat-like, but we can identify some features, and maybe with forced choice behavioral evaluation, people will choose Persian cat with high probability. This is the converse example in which the adversarially trained model recognizes a dog, the standard model recognizes a cat, and I can clearly see this dog's ear here and eye. So this phenomenology is not completely surprising. These models come from the Madri lab, and they show in their studies that when you run single model activation maximization with adversarially trained models, you get images that are human aligned to a certain degree. What's new and is enabled by using controversial stimuli is the direct comparison between the two adversarially trained models. And here we get these images that indicate that none of these models are really human aligned, and you simply cannot see that by just evaluating model through the lens of epsilon robustness. We have some missing models here, and these models are deep generative or hybrid discriminative generative models. If we extrapolate from our MNIST and CIFAR-10 results, we expect that such models, deep generative or hybrid discriminative generative models, will dominate this matrix in terms of model alignment. So I think that developing such models that scale up to ImageNet is an important task. Okay, we now got to the last part of the overview, restricting the stimulus space. So ultimately, we would like to predict human responses for any images. And for that, we need to develop stronger models and essentially solve the problem of adversarial robustness in its deeper sense of model human alignment. But we can also make progress even before we have these models by partitioning the stimulus space into subregions and working or comparing models within these subregions. So we can think about the subspace or manifold of smooth images, 3D renderings, faces, natural images. And within each such manifold, we can search for controversial stimuli and compare model with respect to how well they predict human responses within that manifold. There are very useful tools for achieving this goal that we can borrow from the literature of feature visualization, in which researchers intentionally want to create interpretable aesthetic images that provide some kind of insight about how the internal representations of these models work. So one mean is high order stimulus parameterizations, and I will explain in a moment. And the other is expectation over noise transformations. And both of these are implemented in feature visualization toolboxes. So we have the TensorFlow package Lucid, and there's a PyTorch adaptation for that called Lucent, and we will use the PyTorch adaptation in the hands-on tutorial. So let's begin with high-level stimulus parameterizations. So we've previously seen that we can optimize Z instead of X and then transform Z into an image. But this Z doesn't have to be something which is really image-like. It can be some kind of high-level abstract representation, potentially a flow dimension, that we can then convert into an image. And if we have that, then we can search in that space of Z, which then spans a smaller manifold or subspace in image space. And doing this has two distinct effects on the search for stimuli. One obvious effect is imposing a prior or a constraint on the stimulus space. So a good example is using a GAN latent as a stimulus parameterization. So we take a trained GAN, we throw the discriminator, we don't need it. And now we use the input to the GAN as our stimulus parameterization. And the output of the generator is our stimulus, is our X. And this approach was utilized in a very powerful way for a different aim, finding maximally exciting images in this work from the Livingston group. So let's see how this works in the context of controversial stimuli. So now we see the same kind of procedure, but with this parameterization, and we get somewhat different images. And now let's look at this image, which is formed by contrasting the two standard models, which are not adversarially trained. And now this doesn't look like a noise image. It requires psychophysical testing, but there are now some visible details here. Obviously, this approach of using a GAN imposes a hard constraint on the stimulus space. And you can see that from the dimensionality of the latent. So if the dimensionality of the latent is smaller than the dimensionality of image space, then the GAN cannot span the entire image space. So we are looking within a certain manifold. A second example is the manifold of smooth images. And we can search within this manifold using compositional pattern producing networks, CPPNs. So these are neural networks that transform pixel coordinates into color values. So they typically produce nice, smooth images. And these images are controlled by the weights of this network. And we can use the weights as our stimulus parameterization. So searching this space of weights that produce these synthetic images. And here you see the results for the same controversial stimuli synthesis procedure, but now using this parameterization. And here, although we eliminated high frequency pattern, these two models are still somewhat human misaligned for this image. Here, I actually recognize the ear of a Weimaraner. At least I would choose Weimaraner if I was faced with this image in a trial. The other role that using a stimulus parameterization has is to change the direction of the gradients. And since we are using local search, that may change the local solutions to which our optimization procedure converges. So for example, we can parameterize the image by its complex Fourier coefficients and scale these coefficients in an inverse proportion to their spatial frequency. This method is taken from Chris Ulla's paper in this field. And by doing this, we are slowing down the gradient ascent in high frequencies. This is, to me, was a bit surprising, but gradient descent is not invariant to linear transformations of the optimized variable. So let's see what happens when we do this. And I think that this is the figure that Niko had in his presentation. And now you can see that there's a certain smoothness to these images, which is caused by the optimization procedure making longer steps in the low frequency range, in the low frequency range. And yet, these are not really human aligned. This is a weaker way of regularizing the stimulus space, because still, at least in principle, all of the images are achievable. We still span the entire image space, but we bias our search towards certain solutions. The other tool that we can use is adding noise transformations. So we generate our stimulus, and then before feeding it into the networks, we apply some noise transformations like spatial jitter, which can be thought as analogous to fixation, jitter, slight rotation, scaling, and we use a differentiable implementation of these transformations, and then we can optimize through these noise transformations. So in each optimization iteration, the noise transformation is slightly different, and by doing that, we achieve stimuli that the responses that they elicit in the models are robust to these transformations. And this discourages the optimization from relying on high frequency information that activate particular pixels and through that particular units in the network. And again, this is implemented in the feature visualization toolboxes. So we can think about a continuum of ways of searching in stimulus space that runs between less restricted to more restricted, and pixel space would be the least restricted. Then we have regularized pixel space like that Fourier approach I described, CPPNs, GANs, and maybe the most extreme approach within this continuum, in this continuum, is searching among natural images. So we can just consider a large data set of natural images and use some kind of discrete optimization procedure in order to find a set of natural images that will discriminate between the models. And there are different trade-offs to our choices here. So when we use more restricted stimulus search space choices, we introduce more high-level content by our procedure. And this adds some complexity. For example, if we use GANs, they have their own biases about the manifold of images that they model. So now this interacts with our test models. On the other hand, now it's easier to divide and conquer stimulus domain. For example, think about faces. We can have a parameterization that generates just faces, and now we can test face models. If we go towards the less restricted side, then we must reject non-robust models. And that might be either good or bad, depending on your research program and the kind of problems that you want to solve at the moment. And I think that ultimately, if we take our neural network models seriously as mechanistic models, they should be able to predict human responses in arbitrary settings. So ultimately, we would like to be able to search over the entire image space. Now we have to say that there's another choice that we need to make, which can interact with this first choice, which is the kind of optimization algorithm that we use. And here we have a continuum between more local and more global search optimization algorithms, where HGD would be on the local side and genetic algorithms will be more global. Okay, so I'm done with the overview. I would be happy to take questions. Niko is also available to answer.
Thank you, Tal. That was great and very informative. Let's see. You can ask your questions either in the chat or raise your hand. Yes. Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, Tal. Thank you very much. Hey, what a wonderful talk. And even a luggard like me could at least pretend like he was following along. I have a very general and I suppose naive question, so I apologize in advance. And this is to you and Niko, I suppose. Once one finds a controversial image, and I can see how it can be useful for adjudicating between different models that more closely approximate human vision or human perception at that very coarse kind of inner out level. Once you've identified that image and you've identified this difference between the two models, one that aligns more than not, can you provide an intuition of how can we then interrogate those models to learn something more fundamental about the visual perceptual system, whether that's the functional algorithmic approach at that sort of level of description, or whether that's at the network architecture approach? And just to give you a sense of like the kind of form of answer I was thinking about was, Niko had said earlier that you could imagine two human observers look at the same image and one looks more cat-like, one more dog-like, and that may tell us something fundamentally about the different features that those two observers are using to make that perception. And I'm wondering if you can do that therefore with two models and say, this model is closer to on average, the human perception. Here are the types of features that that human perception may be attending to, or here is the network architecture the human brain may be closer to. Can you say anything about those kinds of intuitions?
Okay, so I think that the immediate insight that we get is from the relative performance of the different models. So that can provide us with an arrow in model space, right? But you are asking about understanding things at the model, at the level of the individual model. And I think that it might be attractive to do some kind of item analysis, looking more deeply into the particular images. And there are methods from the field of interpretable AI, in which we can filter the images, leave just particular features to have a more in-depth characterization of what drives these models. We haven't done this at this point. For example, in the language study, we are thinking about analyzing why humans made the choices that they made for different sentence pairs, whether there was a semantic violation, syntactic violation, and so on.
Other questions? Elena.
Yeah, so I was actually typing this up in an email because it's kind of a leftover question from before, but I think is a good follow-up after Daniel's question. Do you think that, and it's more general, do you think that what could be the use of developing controversial images for humans? So that being, I don't know if you'd be able to do this with just DNNs, but I'm just wondering if it could be used as some form of tool, or these controversial images that are being created by these DNNs that you're comparing could it be used as a tool to better understand something about human visual system, cognition? This might sound like Daniel's question, but I wanted to follow up with it too.
So you're asking about controversial stimuli that target different human individuals, is that right? So first of all, right now we are just modeling the average human subject. This is how we are interpreting these models. And it's a major task to model the distribution of humans. We still haven't done so. I think that once we will be able to do that and generate, as you suggest, controversial stimuli that differentiate between individuals, that might provide new phenomenology of inter-individual differences that we don't have at the moment. Like we can think about Rorschach, like ink spots, and maybe there are very interesting stimuli that we can use in order to spot inter-individual differences in how people's visual system is wired. But for that, we must be able to model the inter-individual distribution.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, yesterday we watched this beautiful keynote and tutorial on voxel-based modeling, where the focus is very much on adjusting models to explain data in individual subjects, right? So this is one way of adjusting models, fitting linear encoding models. And then you have models that are really models of individual subjects. So it would be fascinating to use those models and then create controversial stimuli for those. And that would be a way of testing to what extent these models actually capture idiosyncrasies and can be tested more severely by making these bold predictions about synthetic stimuli that would be predicted to look like one thing to one person and another thing to another person. So that's a fascinating idea, Elena.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh yeah, sorry, Daniel. Yeah, go ahead.
You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah. So one other question, if I could. One of the fascinating things about human perception is our ability to not just conclude some discrete answer, but also to rate our confidence in this. And it's a somewhat debated, I think, in the psychology literature, if that process of confidence is embedded in the process of discrimination, or if it's a separate one that's reflected upon that output. And I'm wondering if, since you have both these elements in your psychophysics and in your AI modeling, so I'm wondering if there's agreement between the psychophysical confidence that's rated by participants, and I suppose something about the posterior probability or the difference between those posteriors that you find between your models. And apologies in advance for the background accompaniment there.
So I would say that in large, these neural network models are very incalibrated. So they tend to be very confident when they shouldn't be. In our analysis in both projects, the MNIST Cypher 10 project and the language project, we tried to move away from evaluating the model confidence, simply because we don't have the basics. So we want the first order choices of the models to be human aligned. So we haven't showed that, but in the MNIST Cypher 10 project, we also analyzed the data while greedily, optimistically fitting the confidence ratings of the models to fit the human ratings. So we gave the models their best chance in terms of calibration. And yet they are very human misaligned, even when we do that. I agree that once we have reasonable models of human choices, it seems very important to also have the confidence ratings right. And that might be related to the core mechanistic properties of these models.
Yeah, precisely. Meaning it may be an insight that they don't align, and that may not reflect the failure of the model so much as a statement about the human process being separated from the human process of confidence, separated from the discriminative process.
I agree.
Other questions?
I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, okay. So Shahab asks, would it make sense or be possible to pit models against each other based on their latent representations rather than their outputs?
We are working on that. Wait a couple of months.
Question. And then T. Zhuang, you want to go ahead?
Yes, and I have very specific questions. Sorry, not very related to your project, but to what my friend currently do. That is about the language model, how much that language model can reflect the human judgment. What we did is that we asked the participants to rate the semantic similarity between the abstract words. And also we create RDM based their ratings. And additionally, we also used the BERT model and work-to-vect model to create RDM models. And we found that the correlation between the computational models and the human behaviors are very low. And to that situation, a bit tricky, and we really don't know how to treat situations. Could you give me any suggestions on it?
So I agree we see similar findings, right? When we test these models, they are quite human misaligned when we test them severely. I would be happy if you could post a link to your study in the chat, and maybe we can take this offline once I read it.
Yeah, actually that is not my project, my friend's project, and she asked me to ask you, and probably that after the meetings, I will email you and we can make a group and discuss together.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your help. Yeah.
Other questions? All right, let's take one more 5-minute break then before the hands-on portion. And so we can meet back here at 10:55. All right, we can move on to the hands-on portion. So there's a link to the tutorial in the chat. If you don't see it, here, I'll post it one more time. All right, Tal, take it away.
Okay, so initially we wanted to have this more similar to a lab section in which you guys will implement the entire thing, but we realized that there are certain limitations to what can be done over Zoom in an hour. So I'm going to walk you through the code that I used in order to generate all of the images that you've seen in my overview. So this uses PyTorch, and you can open that notebook with Google Colab, and you can message if you have problems. You can also open a breakout room and help you to run things. So please do that. And I also invite you to ask questions the moment they arise. Let me know if I miss anything on the chat. Okay, so this is a very detailed tutorial, but I'm going to highlight the most important parts. So let's start. Let's make sure that we have a GPU. Okay, we have a GPU. I strongly encourage you, if you would like to feel how this works, run this notebook on your own machine, and not, sorry, on your own Google Colab session, and not just watch me doing that. You can also introduce certain changes and see how this works.
Tal, can you zoom in and make your text a little larger? Great, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so let's start with the setup. I import PyTorch and TorchVision, a couple of helper libraries. And as I presented in one of my first slides, the first step is to create a common language for the neural network models by encapsulating the pre-processing of the models. So here, there's a class that encapsulates TorchVision pre-trained models. So we can later subclass this class to define different pre-trained models. So let's look at the important parts here. So we need to know what's the input image size that the model expects to get. Here we store the color normalization on which these models were trained. And this is the same normalization for all of the TorchVision models as far as I remember. And we also store the mapping between output units and classes. This might be especially useful if you're going to compare one of these TorchVision models with a model from other library in which the output units were mapped in a different way. So next we load this model into the GPU. Often we will use multiple GPUs, so it's good to have this module aware of which device is being used. And this is a very important line here. So this switches the neural network to evaluation mode, turning off stuff like batch normalization and dropout. If you don't do that, it might act in a way that you didn't intend it to act. I think that it is interesting to have some stochasticity within the network, but don't do that by accident. So remember this line. Okay, now we are looking at the forward function, which takes us from raw images to outputs. So we move the image to the device of the model. This allows us to work with multiple GPUs. We make sure the tensor has 4 dimensions. And now we resize the image to conform with the expected input size on which the model was trained. And this is a differentiable interpolation operation. So we can later backpropagate through that. Here we apply the color normalization. And last, we collect the outputs. So for torch vision models, the outputs that we get are the logits, and we convert these to probabilities. And for these models, the conversion between logits to probabilities is through the softmax function. So we return both the logits and the probabilities. And here you can see how we subclass this torch vision pre-trained model class to define particular pre-trained models. And we can have the details on each model within its initialization function. For example, this is the input image size. Again, please ask questions if anything is unclear. Okay, I will evaluate this cell. And now let's create and load these model classes. This downloads the model weights. Okay. And we want to make sure before we do anything with stimulus optimization that we are interfacing with the models correctly. So this is a very basic sanity check. We are now downloading a couple of test images, and we are testing the classifications of these images in the models. So we can see that these two models do very well. This is obviously an insufficient test. If you interface with the model, please try to test its known benchmarks, for example, ImageNet accuracy. Often, if you get the preprocessing wrong, the size wrong, then you will see probabilities that are too low for easy images or misclassifications. Okay. Now we're going to define a controversiality score. And we have here 2 versions of that. So one version is aimed at multi-label models, models that can assign a high probability to more than one class. And this is consistent with our MNIST and CIPHER study. And the other kind is for softmax models, to multi-class models that they can choose only a single class. So let's look at this function. We supply this, we provide this function with an image, model 1, model 2 as objects, the names of the classes. Alpha is a parameter that controls our smooth minimum. How sharp is it? If we choose a high alpha, then it will behave more like the hard minimum. And let's see if I can scroll this. Yeah. So this is the distinction between multi-class and multi-label models. This is for multi-class. And generating, we would like to see outputs. Okay. So let's look at the core part of this. So if we have a multi-label model, then we are looking at the logits of one model with respect to one class and the other model with respect to the same class with a minus sign and vice versa. And we're going to apply smooth minimum over these 4 terms. And by maximizing this smooth minimum, we're going to push all of these terms up. For simpler multi-class models, then we are going to look at the log softmax. And looking at the log softmax is better than looking at the probability itself due to the numerical precision of this quantity. So now we are taking the, oh, let's try this again. Okay. Sorry about that. So now we're taking the log probabilities of one model with respect to the first class and the other model with respect to the second class. And this is then used as an input argument for the smooth minimum operation. So, well, I should switch to a better browser. Let's use Firefox instead of Chrome. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's hope that this will not happen again. Is the text sufficiently big also here?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we got back to the same place. And so this is our smooth controversiality score. And we also return what we call here hard controversiality score, which is the minimum of the actual probability. So this is hard minimum, and we are looking at the probabilities and not at the logits or log softmax. And this is used for the formal evaluation of the controversiality of these images. In the Ernest and Cypher 10 project, we use this score in order to choose which stimuli we're going to use out of all of the stimuli that we generated. So this is high if the two models strongly disagree on the image with respect to these two classes. Okay, so now let's look at the image optimization loop. So this function receives model 1 and as object, model 2 as an object, two classes, the size of the image, and here we're going to generate 4 controversial stimuli at the same time. And the way it is set up is that there will be no interaction between these different images. So the result will be the same as if you ran this code 4 times. We specify which optimizer. Here we have the parameters of the optimizer and set the weight decay to 0. Here weights would translate to pixels. And learning rate is quite important. So we'd like to adjust the learning rate so we see improvement in good pace, but we don't see sort of the optimization overshooting and going up and down. If we see that, we should reduce the learning rate. This is the readout type. We set it to log softmax because we are going to use multi-class models. Random seed, which is used for creating the initial stimulus. And this controls when we should stop. So either after 1,000 steps or 10 steps without changing the pixel value in to the extent of 1 bit. Okay, so these are the main things. So now let's look at this code. So here we create the initial image, which is a uniformly distributed random noise image between 0 to 1. It might also make sense to use pink noise instead. And Now we'd like to create our Z, right? We're not going to optimize the image, we're going to optimize a version of that whose values run between -infinity and infinity. So in order to create the initial Z, we are using the inverse sigmoid transform. And now we have a Z whose sigmoid transform is that initial image that we created. This is important. We tell PyTorch that we'd like gradients with respect to Z. And here we define an optimizer whose parameters are Z. Okay, and now we get into the optimization loop. So in this line, so first this, we are zeroing the gradient. This is something that we have to do in PyTorch unless we want gradient accumulation. Now we transform Z into X, so unbounded image, into a valid image between 0 to 1. And we feed this X into our function that evaluates the models and returns the controversiality score. Here we define the loss, and this is minus the smooth controversiality score. And it's minus because we want to maximize the controversiality and these optimizers minimize. This summates the loss across multiple images. Here we calculate the gradients and adjust the image. So that's the core part. Here we test for convergence in this part. And finally, we take the resulting X. Here, I'm converting X to an 8-bit image and back to floating point representation because I want to eliminate very fine differences or fine values in the image intensity that cannot be represented on the screen, cannot be presented on the screen. And I evaluate the hard controversiality score of that quantized image. So this X is going to be our final controversial stimulus that we might use in an actual experiment. So let's evaluate these cells. So we have this in memory. And we'll start by taking these two standard neural networks, the ResNet and Inception, and we will create a controversial stimulus with respect to the Weimaraner and Persian cat classes. If you're doing that, you can also change the classes. There's a list online. You can see the link within the model class of the names of ImageNet classes. Here we specify that we are going to use the multi-class formulation. So let's run this. And now you can see, these are the predictions of the first model. You can see that very quickly we convinced ResNet 50 that it sees a Weimaraner, and Inception that it sees a Persian cat. And this converge after 51 steps. We have a perfect controversiality score. This is the hard controversiality score for all of the 4 images, meaning that each model assigns 1 to its target class, a probability of 1.
Tal, does the convergence rate of each model, is that informative at all?
So you will see that some models are slower to change their response. I think that it is informative. This is not a measure that we analyze. Often you will see it if you pair, we now paired 2 models that are really easy to convince. But if you have a model which is harder to convince, then you might see a dynamic in which the model that is more easier to convince changes its classification first, and then the image starts to move towards to convince the other model to drive its classification. But since we are using gradient ascent, if our learning rate is right, we keep improving the controversiality score in each step. So let's look at the resulting images. So you can see these are not the initial images, these are the optimized images. Although to us they look the same, like noise images, and we see that the networks have very strong disagreement about their classification. Okay, so now let's consider models that are somewhat robust. So we're going to import models from the robustness toolbox. This is a Madri Lab resource. They open sourced both the code for training such models and some pre-trained models. This is their reference. So we are now going to install this package from PyPL. We also need wget to download the network's weights. Okay. And now we're going to define another model class for these models. And as you will see, there are certain differences between these models and the torch vision models with respect to the interface. And by encapsulating these details within this class, we can later forget about these differences and have a model agnostic code. So here, this is our load function in which we use wget to download the model weights, if we call this for the first time. This is a robustness package specific code for restoring a model from a saved file. We move the model to its designated GPU. Again, we switch the models to eval mode, turning off dropout and batch normalization. This is similar to what we had in the torch vision class. So we resize the images. One difference here is that we do not normalize the color channels, because in the robustness package models, the normalization is done within their model classes. Okay, so the rest is the same. And here we define different particular pre-trained models. And this is the architecture. This is the kind of LP norm used for adversarial training. And this is the epsilon used for adversarial training. So greater epsilon means more epsilon robust model. Okay, so let's continue. We're now loading these models. This takes a little bit. So let's continue and look at the previous results while they download. So here we optimize the same thing. We take, but with different models, we take Resin 50 and a version of Resin 50 that was adversarially trained using L2 norm-bounded perturbation of the size 5. And again, we use the Weimaraner and Persian cat classes. These models are somewhat slower to evaluate, so I'm going to limit the steps. And let's see if it still loads. So you can see that also here, we managed to increase the targeted classifications. We have here some sort of more complicated dynamics, but eventually we get to the point in which we have good controversiality scores. So each model detects a Weimaraner. This is average probability across the 4 images with high confidence. And a Persian cat with high confidence, the other model, sorry. Okay, so let's see if the model is loaded, reloaded. Sorry about buzzer. So while this runs, we can look at these examples. You can see the model classifications and the resulting images, which largely align with the classifications of the robust model. Okay. In the next step, we are going to create controversial stimulus with the inverse category designation. Let's look at that. So now the standard model sees a Persian cat, and the robust model, adversarially trained model, sees a Wayne runner. And the next step would be to pit the robust models against each other. Let's look at the results. So just let me show you them. So we use Resonance 50 trained using this adversarial training and a wide version of Resonance 50. So it has 2 times the channels. And now we get these images that convince each of the models, but are not either a cat or a dog for us. So this is a direct comparison, direct contrast of these 2 adversarially trained models. Okay, and this is the inverse target assignment. And we get a slightly different result. We are now eyeballing all of these images, but to make any concrete inferences, we must run psychophysical testing using multiple subjects and also multiple images. We should think about these images as random factor that has to be evaluated. So as a rule, I wouldn't have the same stimulus set for all of the subjects. It's good to have several different stimulus groups. Okay, so this is, we've seen this matrix, and now you can go back to this, but I want to proceed to using non-trivial stimulus parameterizations. So let's see how this is done. We are now going to use Torch Lucent, which is a PyTorch adaptation of TensorFlow Lucid. We'll install that. And now we need a slightly more complicated stimulus optimization loop. So here we provide this function with a list of random noise transforms. These are Lucent objects. And this is param f. Let's look at this. I should make a text smaller. So this is a function with no arguments that returns 2 things. It returns the representation, the stimulus parameterization that we're going to optimize, and a function that converts this z into x, into an image. And that function is dependent on the particular parameterization that we're using. For example, it might be a GAN generator. I'm wondering if we want to let people try that in their notebooks and get some feedback or continue?
Try which part in the notebook?
So they can try the direct optimization part. I'm not sure, maybe some people are just watching.
I think most people are probably going along. It's been very smooth so far on my end.
Okay. Please ask questions if anything is unclear. You can also open GitHub issues later on. Okay, so I will continue. So we installed that. And we described these two, this param f function and the list of transforms. So here we are borrowing lucent objects. So we don't need to code too much to achieve this. So let's look at how we create the stimulus representation. So here we create, using this param f, we create create z, the stimulus parameterization. This can be actually more than one tensor. And we have image f, which is a function that takes params and returns an actual image. This composes the list of random transformations into a single transform. And now we define the optimizer with respect to this list of parameters. For example, if we're going to use a CPPN, these parameters would be the weights of the CPPN network. So here we create the image from Z. This is slightly less explicit. And here we apply the random transformation. I'm allowing Lucent to use a different GPU here. We now take the transformed image or images if we are preparing more than one controversial stimuli at the same time and feed it to the models and collect the controversiality score. So next, it's the same thing. And we take the resulting image X here, and that's our final stimulus. So all of the magic is essentially done within this param F that gets us from Z, the stimulus parameterization, to X, the actual image. Okay, so let's try that. And first, we still use the simple pixel space representation, but we are adding very strong jitter. So this is about 10% of the image size, 25 pixels. Let's see how it runs. Still works. Now, if the response of the models was driven by particular pixels in particular locations, that wouldn't work anymore. So we are searching for features that are robust to jitter. So let's skip to the results. And you see that we see some emerging structure in these images. This is somewhat similar to unsuccessful deep dream images. This is from where this method came from. Let's look at the images that we created now. Same thing. So this didn't fix these models evaluation. Even within this restricted stimulus space, these models are very human misaligned. Here you can see the results of this procedure for all of the model pairs. And you can see that for the robust models, these images are smoother than what we've seen before. By the way, when we, I'm not sure if I can explain that, but when we use larger jitter, we often see misconfiguration of the visual features in these images. Okay, and now let's look at less trivial parameterizations. So here we define a Fourier parameterization that downweights the high frequency components of the gradient. And this part, the correlate, also changes the color channels from RGB representation, which is highly correlated, to a decorrelated representation, in which if you will evaluate these channels with natural images, you will see that there is a zero correlation. There's more information on the rationale for doing that in Chris Ula's paper in Distill. I recommend this reading. And we also introduced jitter. So this runs. So here you can see the results for the two standard non-adversarially trained models. Maybe we can zoom in on one of these images. Okay, and here maybe we see some pattern. And again, we are now playing this eyeballing game, but everything has to be tested formally with multiple subjects. So it's not just my impressions. And here you see the result of this analysis, and this is what you've seen in Niko's talk. This is done for multiple categories. We'll skip that. And let's look at these examples for a moment. So we see here an interesting failure mode of both models, both robust models. So each model sees its targeted category, and it doesn't see the other category. So here, one model sees this duck, and the other model sees this bridge, and not vice versa. And here the same duck is now in the grocery store. And here we have this combination between a grocery store and a screen. We see two classes, and each model see only one class. So there is a good question how we should treat such images in which we have two different interpretations when we test human subjects. We might get very different results if we have a forced choice task versus a more open-ended task like the one that we use in the MNIST and Cypher10 project, in which you could rate each category independently. Okay, so next we have the CPPN weights. So again, we are adjusting the weights of a compositional pattern-producing network, and this creates smooth images. We need, for this representation, we need to slow down the learning rate. So there's certain trial and error which should be guided by the optimization dynamics, not by the results. So we'd like to see nice and steady cost decreasing optimization. So now we are adjusting the CPPN weights. Due to some limitation, this is done only for a single image. And we can see that this is a bit jittery. It might mean that our learning rate is still too high. Although it does converge. Now we are running this on the two, again, naive, non-adversarially trained models. And we get a good controversiality score. Let's look, this is the image that I produced when I ran this before. Let's look at the new image. Okay. And now, this is the figure that I showed in the overview, using CPPNs for all of the model pairings. We are approaching the end. Here we see classes, the two robust models contrasted for different classes. This is similar to the matrices that Niko showed in his talk. You also have code here. I will not run it. It takes many hours, but you have code for reproducing these figures using a batch of optimization procedures to generate all of this. And I think that that would be the last part. Now we are going to look at the GAN parameterization. We need some custom code here. And this is a special GAN that we're using. It is a GAN that was trained to invert the representations of AlexNet. So they took AlexNet, they presented natural images to AlexNet, extracted the latent representations, and then they trained again to reproduce these latent representations. So we have 4 different versions of this GAN using different AlexNet features. So this is slightly technical. I won't get into this right now, but we can run this code. We are downloading the GAN weights. Here we're again using the 2 standard models. And this is FC6 latent representation. Again, the optimization here is slightly jittery. This might be related to my learning rate, but it might also be related to the random noise transformations. So we are evaluating slightly different, slightly jittered versions of the image in each iteration. Let's scroll down. So these are the results from my previous iteration. And again, these are non-adversarially trained networks. And when we use the GAN reparameterization, we don't get these uniform noise images. We get images in which there are certain visual features that we might recognize. You can see that there's lots of variability between the stimuli, and this is why it's very important to think about these stimuli as a random variable. We'd like to have a sample of these stimuli. We'd like to test statistically that our comparisons between human and models generalize not only between subjects, but also between items. In the Cypher 10 study, I had some doubt, so I ran the entire procedure again and had another batch of 30 subjects. Luckily, the results were almost the same. So we had a sufficiently large sample of subjects. And no, sufficiently large sample of items. So let's look at the new results. This worked very well, as you can see. Very spooky. as I said before, I'm a bit hesitant about the GAN approach. It's very strong, but it also complicates our interpretation of these images because the GAN has its own biases that might lead to these images. So to demonstrate that here, I create controversial stimuli with a single step, which is not sufficient to achieve controversiality. So these are very, very close. These images are very close to the initial images, which use a random initialization. And we can still see lots of visual detail. And here we see the effect of using different versions of this GAN trained on inverting different AlexNet layers. So that would be pool 5, FC6, FC7, and FC8. And each version of this GAN has its own prior or constraint on image space. This is especially evident for the pair of the non-robust models. So we can compare this with this. This, to me, really looks like a blurred Weimaraner. And this is consistent with recent 50s classification. Okay, so that's it. We finished in time. I would be happy to take more questions if you have them.
Thank you, Tal. That was great and very illuminating. Any other questions? I have one. I mean, it just occurred to me, it should have been obvious before probably, but this could potentially also be useful for evaluating different training regimes and training data sets. Like, for example, it seems like certainly the reconstructions are affected by statistical regularities of different classes in the training set, right? Like the cat often seems centered, whereas the dog is not.
Yeah, I agree. So we have multiple dimensions in which we should compare models. So we have the training data, the training task, the algorithm used to fit the model, and the architecture. So to cover model space systematically, we need to evaluate lots of models. We are now generalizing this controversiality score to address multiple models with a single image. So this way we won't suffer from combinatorial explosion of the number of model pairs that we need to evaluate.
Great. Any remaining questions? Elena.
Hi again. So one thing that occurred to me as you were going through this was how in the general workflow you have all of these parts, but one part that might slow things down would be the human evaluator. That was the key part for determining how, like the quality of these images. So like, what if you were to replace the human evaluator with some sort of arbitrarily determined, reliable model? So something that could be, could have been identified using this work here as like for example, GPT-2 for the language models did very well, and so did Roberta. Those could be one of the models that could be used to replace the human evaluator and then be used as a judge for all other models. Do you think that that could be very useful, scalable, and potentially even change how models are evaluated in the deep learning space?
So I think that if we had a model that we were willing to assume is correct, we would certainly use that, and that would be much more powerful than what we are doing and running slow human experiments. But I think that at this stage, we can't assume that any of these models is a good approximation of human judgments. So this is why we don't have a special status for one of the models. I have to say that in our procedure, each model serves as a judge in a way, but it is done in a symmetric fashion. So each model serves as a judge for the other model in a way, or the counter force. Did this answer your question?
I guess, you know, when I use the word reliable, it's did a lot of work. I do understand that, you know, no one model, like all models are wrong, etc. So, you know, I was just thinking that perhaps in addition to beating benchmark performance levels and accuracy, there could be a, you know, give it like whoever is the lead in beating the benchmarks could then be used to judge other models in addition. But then there could always be some sort of, you know, side thing at the, like a parallel human evaluation aspect to evaluating all of these models, but in conjunction with judging models online, you know, with, you know, whatever model is in the lead, just to kind of add a bit of, you know, another dimension of, you know, seeing how these models work. But I do understand what you mean by each model judging each other is symmetrically and agnostically, and using the human evaluator as that is probably the best way. Does that make sense?
Yep. So we essentially view each model as a potential hypothesis about how humans respond. Mm-hmm. So we'd like to have an equal status for all of the models in our both optimization procedure and evaluation procedure. I do see that once we go beyond pairs of models, when we optimize them, there are multiple games that can be played. You can think about consensus of models, some kinds of competitions. It's a very wide range of methods that can be devised. Maybe Niko wants to add.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating idea, right? So we're looking here at two levels at which to adapt models to our data. The direct level where we adapt the parameters based on some data that we've acquired by measuring human brain activity or animal brain activity or behavior in humans or animals. And that is very expensive data. And usually it's not enough data to set those millions of parameters, right? So we need some alternative to that. And controversial stimuli, in a way, give us another level of analysis where we use these directly parametrically optimized models and pit them against each other. And then with very little brain or behavioral data that is very expensive, we can get a sense of direction, a sense of which models outperform which other models so we can improve models. Of course, it would be much more efficient to be able to use a model as judge, but then a question would be, if you already had the ground truth model, then why are you going on this exploration in the first place to compare all these other models? You could just say, we already know the truth about this perceptual process, right? We have the judge model here. However, I think it's nevertheless an inspiring idea, because in computer science, we also want to just understand the relationships between different models, right? So it could be that maybe we have a very good model for computer vision for some application, but now we want to compress that down so that it fits on a smartphone or something like that, right? And so we want to explore radically simpler architectures. And so then the approach that you're suggesting could be super useful for engineering, for understanding sort of a larger space of models and to what extent they can live up to the high standards of some sort of reference model. That would be That'd be really cool.
Yeah, and I'll stop soon. I was just thinking that it would be one of the aims of the machine learning field, the deep learning field, is to create more highly performing models. That's one of the aims, to be able to solve problems very easily. Whereas with neuroscience, it's more so trying to better understand the human brain, or any brain, or how the brain solves these problems. And I feel like this method can be used to kind of hook one aim to the other. So what I mean is, you have the human evaluator that determines the judging model, which determines which other models is as good, or following the lead of the judging model. And that judging model is determined to be the most human or other brain-like, So it's kind of like jerry-rigging these aims together to pull things in the more brain-oriented direction. That's kind of how I see it. But that's just more of a comment than a follow-up question.
I think that I now understand what you suggested. So if we do this in a sequential manner in which we don't have a single human experiment, then indeed we can sort of gradually focus on the right models. Does this align with? Yeah. So this can be, this in principle, this can be done, especially if we move from our heuristic approach to a more principled Bayesian approach, in which we can quantify our uncertainty about the models as we proceed. And then if we see that a certain model doesn't work very well, we can stop evaluating that model, not waste our human trials.
Yeah, Lana, your comment also makes me think more in the engineering direction again, that it might actually be very useful when you have a reference that is computable but very expensive to compute, right? So then this reference is very expensive, much like human or animal data are very expensive, right? And so you don't want to directly take the normal teacher-student framework and deep learning where you just train a student to emulate the teacher, and as you're trying to compress the teacher into a simpler model, for example. But you want a method that needs much less computation, much less data from the reference model, right? And so at that level, even though our motivation with controversial stimuli is primarily to get evaluations of models of the human brain and animal brains, the primate brain, I think it could also be useful eventually in engineering to have this outer loop where you can deal with the situation where your empirical constraints are extremely costly.
Yes. This is very cool. I'm going to step back because I kind of dominated the conversation, but thank you so much for the keynote and tutorial. I've learned a lot. This is great.
Thanks for all the great questions.
Any remaining questions? All right, well, please join me again in thanking Niko, Tal, and Wen for a fantastic series of talks and great tutorial. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
And we have a few more CCN events coming up. You can see here. So there's 2 more GACs this week, 1 more GAC and a keynote next week, and then the final GAC on useful representations will be held October 1st. So thank you again, and we hope to see you all at future CCN events.